Chinese landscape painting, born of nature's poetry. Part 2. Part 2. Materials used, 4 treasures, painting, calligraphy, traditional sizes and shapes of the scrolls, and the very basic characteristics of landscapes. Okay, now an outline of the main materials that were used by the calligraphers and the painters of these marvelous landscapes. The 4 treasures were and are the 4 tools of traditional Chinese writing and painting: paper, brush, inkstick, and inkstone. We cannot really appraise Chinese painting without dealing with calligraphy. Important to remember. Although silk was first used for writing and painting, the invention of paper in China, about 105 of the Common Era, brought about a revolution in style for calligraphy. This is the first treasure. The paper used in Chinese painting was developed around the beginning of the Tang Dynasty in the 600s, using mainly rice straw. Each kind of paper had a different finish and absorbed ink very differently. With some, ink strokes were crisp and clean. And with others, like this, the ink would spread a little, creating a softer, gentler feel to the image. A vital element for painting was different degrees of absorbency of the paper. The second treasure, the hair brush pen, was invented 1,000 years before the Common Era, or by the legendary Shi Huang, who lived back in mythic times. Brushes were specially cut to a point for calligraphy using different animal hairs. For a Chinese artist, the brush reflects immediately every movement of the body, it is said. It must be wielded from the shoulder and the elbow, and not from the wrist. It can produce a line of any thickness and reveals completely the personality of the artist. As one historian says, over the centuries the Chinese developed what is basically no more than an ancient writing implement into the most sensitive instrument available to any painter. The third and fourth treasures are ink and inkstone. For black ink, soot from burning wood and glue made a black paste, which was then pressed into sticks and dried. Colors were made from various plants and minerals. Then, with drops of water in the well of the inkstone, the ink stick was rubbed firmly in a circular motion to get a strong color. Adding more water diluted it for a light wash for different effects, like the impression of distance. Since black is so important to all Chinese painting, the quality of the ink used has always been vital. The best was made from pine tree soot, pine carbon. The possibilities of ink in all its shades on silk and paper was really a great discovery of the Chinese. Calligraphy was, and still is, considered an art in itself, and valued just as highly. Many of the exceptional pieces were prized by collectors, with their red stamps too. And often the same brush was used for both writing and painting. Even painting was sometimes referred to as writing. The characters have their own subtleties of line and form, and the rules for composing them are very strict. The finest lines were produced by using the tip of the brush held vertically. Various rhythmic movements of the arm and wrist made other lines and shapes. A piece of calligraphy was as revealing of its author's spirit as a painting. Often it forms an important part of a composition, for it may be a poem by the artist himself intended to increase the mood of the work, or it may be a few lines of appreciation by a friend or later connoisseur, or the title itself given by the painter. So the visual connection with bamboo is clear, and often the calligraphy and painting both have equal value. Wu Zhen wrote on one of his paintings, "Bamboo is without mind, yet it sends thoughts soaring among the clouds. Standing on the lone mountain, quiet, dignified, it typifies the will of a gentleman. Painted and written with a light heart by Wu Zhen." So the value judgment of picture rests mainly on its brushwork as derived from calligraphy. The nearest a Westerner can get to the essence of what a Chinese sees in Chinese painting is the concept of touch. The concept of touch. Now, traditional sizes and shapes. The most common painting was done on a long vertical scroll of silk or strong paper and backed for extra support. They were scrolls kept rolled up and brought out only for select friends, those who knew how to appreciate the art, of course, typically the scholar class. Here the servant holds up the top of the painting with a bamboo stick, and another servant at the left holds a rolled up scroll. Other scrolls are on the table. So these vertical scrolls might be shown for a few days according to the season, or just on one occasion. They were to be read from top to bottom, and not originally for display in a museum. Most of them go up 2 meters, 6 or 7 feet or so, and usually 30 to 40 centimeters wide. And of course there are lots of variations. Here's an unusual set of 12 vertical scrolls, on silk in this case, and here placed together so they make a full scene. Of course they would not be shown together in ancient times. This is a museum kind of display. Then we come to hand scrolls, usually about a foot or so high, 30 centimeters or so, and some are short like these, a meter or so, but most are longer as on the bottom. The earliest ones were used as written documents. They could be seen only one part at a time, that is, to read them properly. This one is about 270 centimeters, almost 9 feet. They were meant to be read as a continuous narrative or journey, a progression through time and space, and slowly unrolled by the left hand from right to left to view a segment of it, and then re-rolled again on the right. As the scroll unfurls, so the journey progresses, like reading a book. So the entire hand scroll was not fully displayed. In storage they were kept rolled up, usually covered by silk, and in a wooden box. And there are also album landscapes, often about 70 centimeters square or so, or rectangular like this. Here at the right and left we can see the red stamp marks marking the borders. Album paintings were also done in folios, usually of 8 or more, and could be horizontal, vertical, or square. The individual paintings then became very popular to give as gifts. And some were painted in oval shapes, like a Chinese fan, or even on the oval fans themselves, from about the 1100s on. And a few landscapes were done in the Japanese folding fan shape from the 1300s on. Now for the main, basic characteristics of these landscapes. I won't go into all the various historical schools of this art form, the design schools, way too complex for this survey. Just the main features now. A very refined taste is number one. This grew out of the traditions of calligraphy and brush with ink painting, as practiced by the aristocratic class, the scholarly class, part of being a scholar really. The highly cultured Li Po wrote many poems about landscapes. The refinement of the well-bred poet-scholars here at leisure, both with very sophisticated tastes in art and music. It's interesting, the 4 signs or symbols of a scholar were the lute, literature, painting, and chess. The second main quality of the old landscapes is emptiness. Space as important as form. The bare space makes forms stand out and relate to each other, but the forms should be in balance with the spaces. Space usually represents the spiritual feelings or religious emotions of the artist in some way, not known by the senses, of course. Space was always seen as valuable in itself in China, much more so than in the West. The blank areas were meant to counterbalance the weight of the brushstrokes in a way. The more simplified subjects were the ones most often seen and appreciated, expressing as they do the very essence of this art form. Then, unity and harmony. This is an emphasis on the unity of people with the rest of nature, not separate from it. Here we don't see the people easily, as this is 115 centimeters wide, almost 4 feet, done on silk. But there will be some close-ups. A human presence in almost all Chinese landscapes is very important. Even a little fellow down below carrying some bundles. Usually the most awesome or forbidding mountains show a person on a winding path or on a bridge, or a village or temple tucked in between the hills. The mountains have been there for millions of years, and of course they'll continue. It's us who come and go. These paintings show our dependence on the forces of nature, our connection to Mother Earth. There's a feeling of religious humility in relation to the vast creation, a harmony between people and nature, very important. And there is the amazing use of light. There is no specific source of light shown in these paintings, no sun rays, no shadows. There is an evenness of light throughout, made by the light and dark ink tones contrasting with each other. Many paintings look a bit like a dream, kind of unreal or foggy. They speak of a different level of knowing than what we usually see with just our eyes, a kind of sense of the spirit. Forms and subjects now. As we've been seeing, the subject matters are quite varied, but generally they represent a collection of specific ideas, mostly very symbolic. Harshness and danger, for example, were shown by huge boulders and hills, craggy mountains and mists, valleys, steep cliffs, waterfalls and rivers with dangerous-looking rocks. Many believed they were the closest to their gods, being alone and very high up in the mountains. Our smallness compared to nature was most often portrayed by huts or houses, pathways with very few people on them, a wagon train or donkeys, even workers trudging along. Or by boats and fishermen, by a bridge or meditating monks, always quite small in relation to the overall scene. The Chinese words for landscape, shan shui hua, literally mean mountain and water painting, mountain and water, as yin and yang, the essential elements that make landscape the ultimate vehicle for artistic expression. In nature was the ultimate mystery and harmony of existence. Space, the void, or emptiness were usually shown by clouds, mists, distant hazes. Although clouds often symbolize good fortune and happiness, as in coming rain, the Taoists and Chan Buddhists saw the more spiritual qualities of clouds. And the qualities or mood of the people who were drawn were shown symbolically. Pine trees symbolize longevity and steadfastness, for example, and epitomize self-discipline. And bamboo refers to old age and modesty. The joys of springtime are indicated by blossoms and flowering trees, especially the willow. Or a winter scene of loss and loneliness, often with snow and bare and twisting branches. An illusion of the depth of space was done with special brushwork with ink washes, using lighter tones and pale silhouettes to create an atmospheric scene. The scholar here in the little hut in the center of the picture imagines himself immortal in a cloud in the distant mountains. And the connection is clear between poetry and painting, especially well portrayed here. And there is the concept of heroic simplicity. It is the scholar or poet meditating in nature, on what nature can teach him, and his deep feelings about it. Of course, it is nature as he imagines it to be, as seen in painting. Or he may seem quite ordinary and simple on the outside, but inside he's a super-sensitive hero of perception and insight into the inner meanings of nature, in its menacing and fearsome aspects, as well as in its beauty, nurturing, and joy. With his feelings welling up in his heart, as a poet or painter, he wanted to share them. And hundreds of years later on, he is still sharing them with us in a way. Heroic simplicity. And the last of these basic characteristics of Chinese painting would be called the 6 ancient principles, very important. In about 550, the writer, art historian, and critic Xie He wrote The Record of the Classification of Old Painters. In his preface, he specified 6 points to consider when judging a painting, and he became famous for them. Some of his 6 points are hard to translate, so I will use 2 or 3 different sources. The first is most subtle of all, spirit resonance, or vitality, or fundamental rhythm, reverberation of the life breath even, which is the creation of movement. The life-like spirit of a scene, basically. It may come from the creative vigor transmitted from the artist to his work. The overall energy of a work, Xie He said, is spirit resonance, and without that, there is no need to look further. This is the most difficult principle to translate. Spirit resonance. The second is called bone method, which means the proper use of the brush with accurate strokes and lines. Brushwork is the true bones and flesh of Chinese painting. This refers not only to texture and brush stroke, but to the close link between calligraphy and personality. Painting, like calligraphy, was seen as an extension and expression of the artist, not the real depiction of things or of nature. And there is correspondence to the object, the correct depiction of form, which would include shape and line. The harmony with the lines, or the reflection of the objects, a very correct depiction of the scene and its forms, according to the temperament of the artist, of course, but not realism. The fourth is suitability to type, or the application of color, including layers, value, and tone, or deference to types. It's finding a harmony with the colors that were used, the color application. But over hundreds of years, color became secondary, as painters moved from decoratively colorful and realistic forms to ones using mainly black ink, more restrained and more conceptual. Although light color washes were used, pictures were conceived of in black on white. The fifth is called division and planning, or placing and arrangement, corresponding to composition, space, and depth. It's the design layout. This is the arrangement of details, the positions, to make a careful and pleasing balance between the shapes and forms, and, of course, space. The transmission and perpetuation of the art form was particularly important. And keep in mind that Xie He wrote these 6 principles about 550, when in Europe at the end of the Roman Empire, barbarians conquered and sacked Rome. Xie He referred to old and ancient practices. 6 points to consider when judging a painting, he called them. To wind up now, I'd like to mention again the first of these 6 ancient principles of Xie He. It was the vital rhythm idea, the lifelike spirit of a painted scene, or reverberation of life breath. It refers to some divine spark which must animate the artist, as an historian wrote. Whatever form his art may take, only the expression of this quality can bring it to life. Such a profound ideal, developed so early in their artistic history, has had the greatest influence on Chinese painters of all ages. It is to seek something more than superficial resemblance, to try to express the life force behind every object. As a consequence, the artist approached his subject with that same respect and humility which is demanded of life itself. He may be overwhelmed by the grandeur of a scene, or dazzled by its beauty. He may be amused by its humor. He may see it from far off as a vast panorama, or he may be on intimate terms with a small part of it. He may humbly introduce himself into it, but seldom, as in the West, does he presume to be its master. It remains an inexhaustible source of mystery. A last picture. One painter wrote about his experience in understanding nature. Astonished by this curious spectacle of a gnarled and ancient pine, he said, "I walked around and admired it. The next day I returned with my brushes and did a few sketches of some of the pine trees. After drawing several, they finally seemed real to me." A poetic and visual reflection or meditation can follow now. The emphasis will be on Tang Dynasty poetry, mostly from the book 300 Poems of the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 906, a book which I bought in Taiwan many years ago. And the music, as before, is from the ancient Chinese dynasties by the Beijing Instrumental Ensemble. All credits will be at the very end. So this Tang Dynasty poetry inspired the landscapes, and of course, vice versa.